I went into that house once, just once.
And I left different from the way I entered, without being able to explain exactly why.
Because there was nothing extraordinary about those walls, and perhaps that is exactly what haunts me to this day.
My name is Ananias. I am 8 years old.
I was a carpenter in Nazareth for over 50 years.
I worked alongside Joseph before he died.
And I have known Jesus since he was a child. There's something about the house where he grew up, about the smell of that place,
About the silence of those stones that no one ever stopped to tell.
Nazareth was not what people imagine when they hear the name.
It was not an important city. It was not a center of commerce.
It was not a place that appeared on the maps that the Romans carefully drew.
It was a small village in the interior of Galilee, tucked into a hillside.
That the sun whitened during the summer.
And the cold cracked during the winter.
With perhaps 200 or 300 people living in limestone house. There was a fountain.
And there was the constant smell of working wood because there were a lot of carpenters in that area.
Jose was one of them, and I was another.
We met when we were young, worked together on larger projects that required more than one pair of hands.
And over time, we became what you might call friends, in the simplest sense of the word.
Men who trust each other with work and with silence.
Their house was simple, more than simple.
It was the type of house that no one noticed in Nazareth, because it was like all the others.
Limestone walls with clay mortar, wooden beam ceiling covered with branches and compacted earth.
A single main room that was used for eating, working, and sleeping.
With a smaller space in the back, where the animals stayed at night to provide warmth in the winter.
The floor was made of dirt.
The window was a small opening in the wall facing south to let in the sun without letting in the cold wind from the north.
I entered that house a few months after Jesus was born, because Joseph called me to repair one of the ceiling beams that had...
Maria was inside with the baby, and I worked all day in that small space while she took care of things around me with that serenity she always had.
The baby slept in a kind of improvised crib that Jose had made with leftover wood from work.
It wasn't refined.
It was functional, made with the honesty of a man who knew how to work with wood but didn't have the time or materials to do anything more than was necessary.
I looked at it as I worked and thought about the silent strangeness of it all.
Because rumors about the birth of that boy were already circulating in Nazareth, about the shepherds,
About the wise men from the east.
About the star, about the flight to Egypt that had taken place soon after.
and there he was, sleeping in a second-hand wooden crib in a house where the wind could enter through the cracks in the stones.
I grew up watching Jesus grow.
Not up close, not as someone who was always present, but in the way you see a child in a small village.
In the market, in the synagogue, in the dirt streets that connected the houses to each other.
He helped Joseph from an early age, as was expected of a firstborn son. I saw the two walking together to work, Jesus carrying tools that were still too big for his hands.
Joseph explaining things with that calm patience that was the mark of his way of being.
What I noticed about that boy, what stayed with me after all these years, was nothing supernatural or visibly extraordinary. It was a quality of attention that reminded me of my father, but that went beyond that. Not passing his eyes like we do most of the time, but really seeing. When Jesus looked at you, you felt that he was really looking.
In a way that was a little uncomfortable because we were not used to being seen like that.
Joseph died when Jesus was still young, and who simply grew weaker until he didn't wake up one morning. I was among those who helped prepare the body and take it to the tomb.
Jesus was there, and what I saw on his face that day was not the face of someone who had lost just one parent.
It was the face of someone who had lost a friend, a teacher, a silent companion.
There was a real pain in those eyes.
A human, concrete pain, with no divine distance between it and the surface of the face.
After Joseph's death, Jesus took over the work.
We continued crossing paths because Nazareth was too small for two people to avoid each other. Sometimes we worked on projects nearby.
He was good at his job, skilled with his hands, honest in his work.
The type of craftsman who delivered what he promised without needing anyone to be on top of him demanding it.
But there was something I didn't know how to name in those years. A feeling that he was in Nazareth, but not entirely from Nazareth.
As if that village was the place where he lived, but not the place where he entirely belonged. And then the day came when he left. It wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, there was no formal farewell. He just went. And Nazareth continued to be Nazareth, with the same dirt streets, the same stone houses, the same small market, the same synagogue. But there was a space where he had been that had not been filled by anyone else.
The story started coming in a few months later.
Healings, teachings, crowds that followed him through Galilee.
I listened and stood still, trying to fit these stories in with the boy who had grown up in front of me, and with the young man who had carried tools alongside his father, with the carpenter who I had seen working wood with calloused hands. And what surprised me was not that the stories seemed impossible.
It was that somehow, looking back, they made perfect sense.
I went back to their house once, after he had left. Maria still lived there, older, quieter, with that serenity she always had. And as I looked at those limestone walls At that dirt floor, at that small window facing south, I began to understand something that I hadn't understood while he was still there. God had chosen that place, not despite the simplicity, but because of it. I had chosen those walls without ornaments, that floor without covering, to create the environment where the Son of God would learn what it is to be truly human. Not what it is to be human in palaces, not what it is to be human in centers of power,
but what it is to be human in the most ordinary everyday life, in work that hurts your back,
in the cold that comes in through the cracks, in grief that has no explanation.
In life that continues even when you don't understand why. He learned all of this in those walls.
And perhaps that's why when he spoke to people, anyone, fishermen, tax collectors, women society had discarded, beggars, children,
He spoke from a place they recognized. Not from above, not from outside, but from within. From a place that knew the smell of wood and the weight of exhaustion and pain of losing someone you loved.
My name is Ananias. I was a carpenter in Nazareth.
And I knew the house where Jesus grew up, not as a sacred place, but as a common place.
And that's exactly what taught me the most important thing I've learned in 80 years of life. God doesn't need extraordinary places to do extraordinary things.
The house was simple. The boy who grew up in it changed the world. And the distance between those two things is where faith lives.